Thank you, Rajul. Thank you for the introduction. My name's Lawrence Haddad. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah. So my name's Lawrence Haddad. I'm a senior research fellow at IFPRI, rarely seen, based in the UK, but great to be back at the mothership. This is the report. I hope you pick a copy up. I don't know if you're allowed to pick up more than one copy, but I hope you can if there are enough of them out there. Before I say anything about what's in the report, let me just first do the roll call, because Rajul said it's an inclusive process, and it really is. There are hundreds of people behind this report. So first of all, I'd like to thank my co-chairs, Corinna Hawkes and Imorn Wasantwisud. Imorn and Corinna, thank you. I'd like to thank, they've been amazing. This is going to be a long round of thank yous. I'd like to thank the independent expert group, who are 25 people who are ultimately responsible for the quality and the relevance of this report and the integrity of this report. And many of them are in the room, so thank you guys. I'd like to also thank the stakeholder group. Now, the stakeholder group is chaired by Augustin Fleury and Fru Lemma. Augustin is here with us today. And they're a group of about 25 organizations and countries who are essentially set the strategic vision for this report and are champions of this report. And they give us fantastic support within our writing group. I'd like to thank the Secretariat of the report. They do a lot of the unglamorous, unseen, but so essential work behind all of this. And Tara Sham from IDS is the head of that Secretariat. So I'd like to thank Tara very much, and also Catherine G, who gives us fantastic support from the IFPRI base as well. I'd like to thank, I'm running out of people to thank, I'd like to thank the CKM team at IFPRI. They've been absolutely amazing in all facets of the report. The report wouldn't be seen as widely, wouldn't look as great, wouldn't read as great if it wasn't for them. I'd like to thank the 70 authors who, in addition to the expert group, who are behind this. There are lots of panel writers, lots of section writers, and one of the joys and one of the frustrations of the report is pulling all of that together and trying to make a coherent narrative. Finally, I'd also like to thank the 11 funders who fund us. They give us an incredible amount of support beyond just the funding. They lend us their networks, their energy, and their influence. So I think I've just about covered everyone. So thank you. And one final thank you is to all our partners. We have lots of communications partners outside of IFPRI. So we call this a report, but we like to think of it as a report, but it's also an intervention. So I think I will present some of the main findings of the report, and Corinna will present some of the action-oriented points that we think will be relevant to you in this room. So this is the outline. We're talking about nutrition driving the SDGs. We'll talk about progress on nutrition outcomes, nutrition status. We'll talk about progress on actions. We'll talk about financing, a little bit on capacity. Then we have 3 chapters that we think we included this year because we thought they were important. Climate, obviously, for the COP. That's going to happen in November. Many of you in the room know about that, will be in that, and are trying to influence that. We'll talk about food systems. Many of us in the room are deeply enmeshed in understanding and analyzing and coming up with policy options on food systems. Business is the unmentionable topic in nutrition, so we thought it would be good to start talking a bit more about it. And finally, accountability and data. And accountability and data are the bread and butter of the report. If we didn't focus on data and accountability, we would be just another report. And then finally, the calls to action. So, nutrition driving the SDGs. I don't know if any of you read this article from The Economist, which was on designer babies. But this is a graphic that I've pinched from them. Sorry, CKM, I didn't ask for permission to do it. But this is the picture from that article. And I was just reading it, I was interested in it. But I was looking at it, high IQ, being a sprinter, which means, wow, this is quite exciting. Being a sprinter, which is, body length, muscle mass, 20/20 vision, prevention of strokes. All of these things are what you get from improved nutrition in babies, all of them. So my opening statement, if you want designer babies, invest in nutrition. All you financiers, if there are any of you in the room, please take note. But we do some more serious analysis in the report. We pull together all the evidence that's emerged in the last year about the economic returns to improve nutrition. So last year's report, John Hodnott kindly did a bunch of analyses for us on benefits and costs. How much does it cost to scale up nutrition interventions? What kind of benefits do we get across the life cycle? And it turned out that across 40 countries, the median benefit cost ratio was 16 to 1. What a fantastic investment. That's a 10% compound rate of return over a 30-year period. We've got a Wall Street expert here. I think he'll tell us that that's a pretty good rate of return.
That's cash on cash.
No, now you're getting into the specifics.
Set up 2 to 1, it could be 32.
I didn't understand anything of what you just said, so.
2 to 1 leverage is nothing.
Okay, I think you're saying good things. The new studies that we found from Brazil by Cesar Victoria and Malawi by the African Union, the AUC, African Union Congress, and WFP, and 4 case studies from the World Bank, all show roughly similar orders of magnitude. Different methods, different data sets, different countries, different contexts. So that's hugely reassuring. The claims that we and others made last year have been backed up by a whole slew of new studies. So nutrition is a fantastic economic investment. Of course, there are other reasons to invest in nutrition: human rights, prevention of child mortality, and intergenerational equity. All of those things are, of course, really important. We focus on economic returns here because we ultimately want ministers of finance and prime ministers and presidents to realize that this is a central aspect of their sustainable development, not just a health issue. We did a very simple word cloud analysis of the draft SDG Outcome document, the Sustainable Development Goal Outcome document that will be finalized next week. Probably is already finalized, will be ratified next week. And all the usual words are there: development, gender, hunger, education, health, women, climate, poverty. They're all there, but nutrition doesn't show up in the word cloud, and nutrition barely shows up really in the SDGs. It's in the title of one of the goals, it's in one of the 169 targets, it's in 2 of the indicators. Really, it needs to be in more than 2 of the indicators. And there's still some time left for the indicator process. It hasn't been finalized yet. And any of you who have any connection with that process, it's a technical process, but it's also a political process. So if any of you have any connection to that process, please fight to get more nutrition indicators in that set of SDG indicators. So nutrition barely registers in the SDGs. Let me move on to progress on nutrition status. One of the big surprises for me in the report was this slide, this number. Last year, we said 24 countries were on course to meet the World Health Assembly stunting global goals. These are the goals to 2025. So 24 countries were on course in 2014, and most of the countries were off course. That number jumped up to 39 this year. So 39 countries on course to reduce stunting at a fairly brisk pace by 2025. Why is that? It's not because a bunch of countries suddenly improved their performance over the last year. It's because a whole slew of new data came in this final MDG year. A whole bunch of new data came in to give us a much better, a much more accurate, it's more accurate and much better picture of what's happening. This just emphasizes the importance of having up-to-date data. So that's good news. Wasting also movements in the right direction. Last year, 59 countries on course. This year, 67 countries on course. So not enough, but some movement in the right direction. Same for under 5 overweight. 31 countries in 2014 on course with good progress, up 39 this year. Again, the bulk of the countries are off course or at risk, but the forward movement is really, really encouraging and really fantastic. Exclusive breastfeeding rates, this is the first year we did some assessments of on-course and off-course. I should say all of this data on the outcomes I'm showing you now have been generously shared with us by the World Health Organization and UNICEF and other UN agencies, and they've been absolutely phenomenally supportive in helping us interpret the data and understand the weaknesses in the data as well as the strengths. We worked with them to come up with a set of on-track, off-track, on-course, off-course rules. They're in the report. 32 countries are on course to meet exclusive breastfeeding targets. 6 countries are off course with a very serious reversal, so a decline of more than 10% in exclusive breastfeeding rates. Most countries are off course. Interestingly, only 78 countries had enough data out of the 193 for us to make an assessment. Remember, this report really is global. It looks at all countries and all types of nutrition outcomes, not just undernutrition. The number of countries that have reduced adult obesity rates, 0. Really depressing. These are numbers from WHO over the 2010 to 2014 period, and hopefully we can get into that a bit more in the discussion with the panel and the Q&A. This is the global scorecard. I don't have time to go into it in detail, but basically these are the 8 indicators. Each row is an indicator. Each number is a country. What we want is to get more countries in the green zone and less in the red zone. So we want to have less red and more green. We also want less of this gray. Gray means that these countries don't have enough data to make an assessment. So we want to get rid of the gray and the red and move it all over into the green. So this is a really important global scorecard, we think, and we think every policymaker should have this on their wall. Progress on nutrition actions. We do make an assessment of the Nutrition for Growth actions and commitments that we're signed up to. We find that 30% of those commitments are not specific, measurable, assignable, realistic, and time-bound. They're not SMART. So there's a big pledging moment coming up in Rio next year, and we're saying to all the potential pledgers, please make your commitments SMART and ambitious. We want them to be SMART and ambitious, specific, measurable, ambitious. We also go way beyond the N4G growth actions, and we look at undernutrition interventions. These are the so-called 12 Lancet essential nutrition interventions or high-impact interventions. And we say, look, lots of us have the ambition to scale up these interventions. There's a whole movement called the Scaling Up Nutrition movement, but many countries, all countries, want to scale these interventions up. But at the moment, we actually don't have the data to figure out whether we are succeeding or not. So of the 12 interventions, 6 of them, no comparable national data exist in the WHO, UNICEF, WFP, FAO databases. For 3 of them, we do have national comparable data, and for the other 3, we've got some proxy indicators. So we don't know enough about scaling up, and that's important because what's measured gets done, and what's measured gets managed. But it's also the case on interventions to improve food systems and improve food environments. We get some data from the Nourishing Network's initiative. We look at data from 67 countries that have implemented policies to improve food systems and food environments, things like labeling, location, investments in fruits and vegetables and pulses, those kinds of interventions to improve the food environment and what's available. And we find that of those 67 countries, 63% of them are in high-income countries, 27% are in upper-middle-income countries. Hardly any low- and middle-income countries are implementing these kinds of policies, even though obesity, adult obesity, is increasing in every country. So there's a big implementation gap. That's what Rajul highlighted in her overview. Finance, to scale up, we need money. It's not the only thing we need. It's not necessarily the essential thing we need, but it's hugely helpful. How are we doing? To assess how much money we need, first of all, we need to figure out how much is currently being spent. Last year's report, we could only report that for 3 countries. This year's report, we have data for 30 countries because 30 Sun member countries stepped up in 2013, led by the Sun Movement Secretariat. These are the countries. They initiated a process of going through every single line item in every single page of their budget, their national budgets, and saying, this is a candidate, we're going to pull that one aside, and now let's dig deep in that candidate and see how much is actually nutrition and how much isn't. As when we had to stop writing the report, 14 countries had completed that exercise. The percentage of their domestic budget allocations to nutrition I should say, in the undernutrition side of things. I don't think they looked at the overnutrition side of things. So this is really for undernutrition. But it's across all sectors. It's not just health. It's social protection and education and poverty and water and sanitation. 1.3% of their national budgets is spent on nutrition in a broad sense. Now, is that high or low? It's very difficult. We don't actually have a benchmark of what is a desirable, attainable level. But last year's report said 45% of all national budgets are spent on things that are highly, 45% of all national budgets are spent on things that are highly relevant for nutrition, like agriculture, health, education. So I think there's a big envelope for increasing that 1.3%, not to 45%, of course, but in fact the countries themselves identified an upper bound of about 4%, where they thought that if they pushed harder and if they had champions to help them push, they could get up to about 4%. So I think one of our challenges in the report and the community is to help those national champions go from 1.3% to 4%. What about donors? Donors, 4% of spending to nutrition is the latest figure that we could get. Donors have done a really good job on the nutrition specific. These are the direct interventions. They're spending on direct interventions, the 12 Lancet, if you like, or the essential nutrition actions that WHO say are really important. They've doubled their spending from $500 million last year to nearly $1 billion this year, so that's fantastic. We also have a much more rounded estimate of the nutrition-sensitive spending. These are spending in agriculture and water and education that the donors think are much more nutrition relevant than some of the other spending in those sectors. And that's $4 billion, because a couple of very big donors went through that process and generated the evidence. So put those two together, you have $5 billion, divide that by 130 billion of ODA, and you've got about 4%. That's great. We all think that number has to increase, however. Why do we think that number has to increase? An analysis from the World Bank and R4D, Results for Development, and supported by 1,000 Days and by SIF, go through a whole big estimate for estimation process for what will it take to get to the 2025 global target for stunting reduction for the 37 highest burden countries. They go through that process. It's a rigorous process. They conclude that governments need to double their spending over the next 10 years, and donors probably need to quadruple their spending. This is on nutrition-specific interventions, the 1 billion I was talking about. So the encouraging thing is that donors have essentially quadrupled their nutrition spending on these items over the last 5 years. We need them to do it again. But more importantly, I would say governments have to step up. If governments don't increase their spending, it doesn't really matter what donors do. Governments I think governments are the binding constraint here, spending by governments. We also talk about climate. There's a chapter in climate because, of course, this is the year of climate change, the COP, where we actually think something might get done. And we also put it in because there was a sneaking suspicion that the nutrition community isn't paying enough attention to climate. So climate community might not be paying enough attention to nutrition, but nutrition is not paying enough attention to climate. And here's some evidence that we highlight from the World Bank analysis. This is looking at height for age Z scores, so the standardized height for age for kids under the age of 3 in India. This is data from the 2005-2006 national survey, and controlling for a whole range of things like income, education, location of household size. They control for that through regression techniques. They find that height for age Z scores vary enormously by the month in which the kid is born. So if a child is born in February, they're going to have a much better height for age Z score than a child born in April or May. And this is for climatic cycles and disease cycles and rainfall cycles and a whole range of food production cycles. How big are these changes? They're big. 0.2 is roughly the median impact of complementary feeding interventions. And that's highlighted in the slide. So it's really a lottery which month the kid is born in, and we need to end that game for under 3 kids. And so nutrition programs need to do a better job of climate proofing and season proofing their nutrition programs. But the reverse also is important. Climate people have something to gain from engaging with nutrition people, diet choices have a big impact on CO2 emissions. We know this. I'm sure there are many people in this room that know this. This is some from a paper published at the end of last year in Nature by Tillman and Clark, and they go through lots of diet surveys, and they come up with some stylized diets, and they say, look, these different stylized diets have very different CO2 emissions. So that's a spur for the climate community to come to the food systems community and the food environment community to say, in your context, can we find diet types that are good for health and nutrition, but also good for climate mitigation? It may not be possible, but the aggregate numbers suggest that it is possible. We also focus a lot on food systems this year. ICN2 was really all about food systems. We know food systems are a major driver of undernutrition, but also of things like diabetes, overweight, and obesity. And just a few weeks ago in The Lancet, there was an update of the global burden of disease. Poor diet was reaffirmed as the #1 risk factor in the global burden of disease. Poor diet is the #1 risk factor in the global burden of disease. So what drives poor diet? Individual choices do, but food environment does as well. And food environment is determined within a food system. So how can we do something to make food systems more nutrition friendly? The first thing we did was to we had Rachel Nugent was the lead author on the food systems chapter at the University of Washington, and we challenged her. We said, can you come up with a diagnostic, with a dashboard at a global level, but that will be useful for different types of food systems, to say how nutrition friendly is your food system? And so she came up with 13 indicators that are in the report in 4 different buckets of indicators, and these are the 4 different: how affordable, how consumption diverse, what are the outcomes it's driving, and how environmentally sustainable is it? Is it the be-all and end-all of dashboards? No, of course not. Is it a useful starting point for more work in this area? Yes, we think so. It's a modest offering to that whole debate. We spend quite a bit of time in the report on business, and we do this. When we were talking to people and trying to read around the subject, we kept getting into this debate about, I can't work with the private sector if I'm in nutrition because I can't trust them. And another group of people who said, well, the way you build trust is by engaging. So we're in this real chicken and egg situation where it comes to nutrition and business. And we try to acknowledge that in the report, and we try to put forward the case for various tools and approaches that can build transparency and can improve monitoring, because those are key elements of trust. So we talk about how important it would be to have a register of public-private partnerships, a public register of those, so we can see what's in those. Very much similar to the initiatives around land grabs and large-scale land acquisitions. Let's make that transparent. Can we have a nutrition transparency initiative, which is essentially a voluntary exercise similar to the extractive industry transparency initiative, which has been quite successful? Can we have an enforcement litigation fund? The tobacco industry, Gates and Bloomberg have set up an anti-tobacco litigation fund to help governments enforce legislation that's on the books. Can we have more disclosure mechanisms like the Access to Nutrition Index, which asks the big companies to rank themselves on 180 different indicators, and then they report that? Can we have more public research initiatives? There's not one single dedicated publicly funded research initiative on whether the private sector's involvement in food security and nutrition is a good thing, and when it's a bad thing, and under which conditions is it positive, and in which conditions is it a negative. There isn't one. And we think that's so important. We think trust is so important because there are lots of opportunities to move nutrition forward. It's not just about the food sector, although there are lots of opportunities in the food sector. Fortification is a proven area, but there are also other areas around mobile phones, health, and logistics capacity. So one of the key recommendations we make is that dialogue needs to happen. There's no dialogue at the moment. There's a group over here that thinks business is the devil. There's a group over here that thinks business is the bee's knees, the best thing for nutrition. And there's a silent majority in the middle, and I'm in the middle, saying, I'm pretty sure it is a good thing for nutrition in some circumstances, for some groups, for some interventions, for some in some contexts for some types of markets. But I don't have a guide. I don't have any shared understanding of how to make my way through that minefield. And I think, so we call on the big UN agencies, together with others in an inclusive process, to establish a time-bound commission to develop a shared understanding of the roles and responsibilities. Where is it okay? Where is it definitely not okay? And what are the bits in the middle that we need to tread carefully? Finally, accountability and data. I wonder how many of you have these kinds of devices on your arms. Anyway, that's your personal accountability mechanism. We focus a lot on data. We in the chapter we talk a lot about community accountability, national accountability, but I'm just focusing on the data gaps here. Last year, we said that only 99 out of 193 countries could measure their progress on the 4 WHA targets, the 4 of the 6 that we could track progress on. That wasn't very good. It's improved. Now 108 countries can measure their progress on these 4 targets, but still 58 countries can only measure their progress on one of the one of the 4 World Health Assembly targets. And these are targets that all ministers of health signed up to in 2012. Finally, on calls to action, and I'm going to pass over to Corinna Hawkes. Corinna, over to you. And yeah, thank you. Thank you, that's very kind, but I'm actually remiss because there's one group of people I didn't thank, and it's you always ignore the ones you're closest to. I'd like to thank the fantastic data analysts behind this report. There's 3 of them, Kamal, Camilla, and Natasha, and I'd just like to thank them very much because they've been incredibly brilliant at fielding really unreasonable requests at the last minute. So thank you guys.